Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Mole, Senior Health Reporter with Technica. And today we're going to talk about a class of drugs you're probably hearing a lot about in the news these days, GLP-1 drugs, or drugs that act like the hormone glucagon-like peptide 1. These drugs have proven to be blockbuster treatments for type 2 diabetes and obesity. But while their popularity has exploded in recent years, it took decades of hard work to get here. And the work is still not done. As we speak, there are numerous studies going on that suggest that these drugs may not be done in pressing us. Studies in laboratories, animal models, and even some human trials have suggested that GLP-1 drugs could have roles in reducing inflammation, protecting the kidneys, liver, and cardiovascular system, and maybe even protecting the brain from degenerative disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So today we're going to talk a little about how these drugs were discovered and developed and what's up next. And we have the perfect guest today to dive into this rich and exciting field, Dr. Daniel Drucker. Dr. Drucker is a senior scientist at the Lunenfeld Tanenbaum Research Institute and professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. He was among the key contributing researchers to the earliest work on GLP-1 drugs and has since spent his career working to understand the biology of this powerful hormone, as well as how drug mimics can be used to treat diabetes, obesity, and other diseases. So welcome, Dr. Drucker, and thank you so much for being here. Before we get into our discussion, I just want to give our audience a quick reminder. If you have any questions, drop those in the comments section on YouTube, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So, Dr. Drucker, I was hoping to start sort of at the beginning, talk a little bit about how this all got started. So just to set the stage, researchers had suspected for many decades that there was an undiscovered hormone that was directing insulin secretion after people ate their meals. But the research didn't really pick up until maybe the 1970s when there were advances in DNA technology. And with the contributions of many researchers, you and your colleagues in the 1980s were able to show that a short version of this glucagon-like peptide, GLP-1, could spur the release of insulin in rat pancreatic cells when blood sugar levels were high. So looking back, I was hoping to talk with you just about, what were the big steps in your mind that got you there? And did it feel like a huge discovery at the time, which feels like it is now?
It was pretty exciting at the time because we didn't know what GLP-1 did. So the first experiments in the 80s that said, hey, GLP-1 stimulates insulin secretion, that was exciting because we had just seen these sequences in the gene, had no idea whether the protein was made and whether it was active. And even at that time, there was a thought that this GLP-1 type of action could be harnessed to treat type 2 diabetes. But there was never a glimpse of the world that we live in today, where we have the new era of obesity medicine. That came much later.
Hmm. So, yeah, so you're kind of saying, it took a while to connect those, but and there wasn't really a straight path. So I was hoping to talk with you about some of the earlier versions of GLP-1 drugs, not the semaglutides and the tirzepatides that we have now. There was one in particular called I might be saying, I hope I'm saying the name right, exenatide. And that was discovered from the venom of Gila monsters, essentially, and came about in the 1990s. And so can you talk a little bit about how those early versions of GLP-1 drugs kind of shaped your research and getting to the versions we have now?
Yeah, so we knew, that GLP-1 worked in humans, but the native hormone that we all have in our bodies is broken down very rapidly. And that posed a challenge. How can we make a medicine that can withstand degradation? And many companies were working on this, but there was a biochemist in New York named John Eng who serendipitously discovered in this lizard venom, uh, stuff that he analyzed, a peptide that looked like GLP-1. It was about 50% similar to GLP-1, but it was resistant to degradation. And, to his credit, he went around to a bunch of drug companies and said, I have this molecule from a poisonous lizard. When the lizard bites you, you can get very sick. And could you help me develop this for the treatment of type 2 diabetes in people? And you can imagine the responses he got were pretty dismissive, but he persevered and he found a partner, a biotech company in San Diego called Amylin, pharmaceuticals. And to their credit, jointly, they helped bring the first GLP-1 drug to market, this lizard venom protein called exenatide, and that was approved April 28th, 2005. So it's really a wonderful story.
Yeah. And it's still being used in clinical trials, as I understand,
It's
right?
still being used clinically. It's approved either as a twice a daily injection or there's a once weekly form. Now, its use has, diminished somewhat that we have now many powerful versions that have supplanted its use, but it's still available in many countries.
Yeah. So getting to the sort of the semaglutide version of GLP-1 drugs, it took some work in figuring out maybe some of the other players that were involved. And I know you did some work on an enzyme called DPP4, and that seemed like it was pretty critical to understanding how to make the GLP-1 drugs that we have today. Can you talk a little bit about that part?
Yeah, so the rapid degradation of GLP-1 is in large measure due to this enzyme that just chops it up. And we and others found that if you could inhibit the enzyme, uh, those enzyme inhibitors by themselves could become drugs. In fact, they were very successful medicines. Your readers and listeners might know them as Januvia, marketed by Merck. At one point, it was selling more than $6 billion a year. But they didn't produce weight loss. They were pretty good medicines for type 2 diabetes, but there wasn't a lot of weight loss because you needed to get the GLP-1 levels much higher to get the weight loss. So that came later with liraglutide and dulaglutide, and today semaglutide and tirzepatide, where the levels are much higher and the molecules are much more potent.
Right. And so, you know, kind of thinking about how it works, people might think that like, if you have this GLP-1 in the gut, it suppresses sort of gastric and emptying and increases insulin production. And that's just how it works. But in the 1990s, you actually found that it's not working directly in the gut entirely. It's working also in the brain. And so I was curious if you could talk a little bit about those experiments with, I think they were done in mice, and how surprising that was that there was these GLP-1 receptors in the brain as well as in the gut, where we think about sort of appetite suppression and food intake regulation might be centralized.
Yeah, so there are a lot of GLP-1 receptors in the brain, and even to this day, we still don't have a complete picture of what they're all doing. When we removed the GLP-1 receptor from mice using genetics, the mice didn't eat more and the mice didn't gain weight. So GLP-1 was not essential for control of body weight. But when we gave GLP-1 to the mice, they basically stopped eating. And if you gave GLP-1 continuously, they lost weight. And this was not just a non-specific effect, because if you carried out the experiments in the mice without the receptor, the mice didn't respond at all to GLP-1. So this really told us that, hey, this is something interesting here. And in early clinical studies, we did see some weight loss in people treated with these medicines. But it was hard to understand whether this was just due to the nausea and the vomiting and the gastrointestinal distress that we know are associated with these medicines, or whether this was something more useful that could be exploited to treat type 2 diabetes and obesity. And today we know that you don't have to feel sick to lose weight with these medicines. A lot of people just say, I'm not hungry, but they're not feeling unwell.
Yeah. So I wanted to go back a little bit to the sort of the first part you talked about there. And so it really struck me as interesting that when you have these mice that are knockouts for GLP-1 receptors, which means they have no receptors for this hormone, and they can't detect it, if they're given it or if their body is making it. And they don't overeat or become obese. And so this is such a powerful system, but it's not essential. So I guess that struck me as a little surprising. Is that surprising to you? And kind of maybe, is there a good explanation for that?
Yeah, so there are some hormones in physiology and medicine that are both physiologically essential and pharmacologically essential. And a good example of that is insulin. If you don't have insulin, you develop diabetes, and we can treat diabetes with insulin. But then there's another hormone that you may be familiar with called leptin, and this is made by our fat cells, and it signals to the brain whether or not we should eat. And if you don't have leptin or you don't have the leptin receptor, if you're a mouse or a human, you're hungry all the time, you gain a lot of weight. It's a really difficult situation. So people thought, okay, let's use leptin to treat people with obesity, and it didn't really work. And so there we have an example where it's physiologically important, it's pharmacologically not useful. And GLP-1 is the third example where physiologically, if we take it away, mice and humans don't develop diabetes. Mice and humans don't eat too much and develop obesity. So it's physiologically not really essential for control of your blood sugar or control of your appetite. But pharmacologically, if we give it as a medicine, it's amazingly powerful to control both type 2 diabetes and to produce weight loss. So there are many different examples. Some are both physiologically and pharmacologically relevant, like insulin. Leptin is physiologically essential, not pharmacologically useful for obesity. And GLP-1, not really physiologically essential, but pharmacologically amazing for diabetes and obesity.
Yeah. And so I think that kind of is even more fascinating in the context of sort of what we were just talking about in terms of receptors in the brain. And we don't really know everything about what they're up to. And there's also receptors kind of in little pockets of populations in other organs like the kidney, liver, heart. You know, so for this sort of non-essential but also powerful system, do we have any clear ideas of what those are doing in those organs, or is GLP-1 interacting with that, or having protective effects potentially directly in those organs, or is it's just unknown yet so far?
No, I think we're learning more about this. So I think there are multiple ways that GLP-1 produces what I call the magic, the great effects we see in people. And so one is direct. So there are receptors, as you mentioned, in the blood vessels, in the heart cells, in the kidney cells, and we can manipulate those genetically in mice, and we see that they're important. They're absolutely important. But then we have the role of GLP-1 to control blood sugar in people with diabetes, to reduce body weight in people with obesity. That's helpful as well to reduce the complications. And then, as you mentioned, we have an anti-inflammatory effect of GLP-1, and reducing inflammation is also healthy. So it's multiple different components of GLP-1 action that contribute to the benefits that we see.
Yeah. And so I guess, in terms of that, I know there's been a lot of talk, especially in sort of the type 2 diabetes population studies, the benefits that you're seeing, especially with cardiovascular benefits like lower stroke risk and things. Is that really benefits of weight loss, or is it, some additional mechanism of GLP-1? How difficult do you think that's going to be to disentangle those things in future studies? Do you think that's always going to be a kind of a tricky thing to work out, or do you think it'll be clearer with more work soon?
Well, I'll disentangle it for you right now. So I think we
Oh,
know
okay.
the answer. So there's three lines of evidence that answers your question. So in animal studies, I can reduce the size of a heart attack in mice, whether or not the mouse has diabetes or whether or not the mouse loses weight. So it's independent of the effects on blood sugar and body weight. But we all say in my lab, we work on mice, we all say, well, that's mice, what about humans? So we had a big outcomes trial in people with heart disease and type 2 diabetes, and it was called the Harmony Outcomes Trial with a GLP-1 drug called albiglutide. It was marketed by GlaxoSmithKline. And this albiglutide drug was so disappointing clinically that it was withdrawn from the market by GSK because it just didn't lower blood sugar very much, and it didn't have a very profound effect on weight loss. Yet this drug that was withdrawn from the market because they couldn't sell it as a good diabetes drug or a good weight loss medicine produced a 22% reduction in heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular death. So this profound effect to benefit people with risk of heart disease, yet almost no effect on diabetes and body weight. And then this past year, we had the SELECT trial in people with obesity, a huge trial, more than 16,000 people treated with semaglutide. And they again had a 20% reduction in heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular death. And we could say, well, how much weight did you need to lose to get the benefit? And the answer is it actually didn't matter if you lost weight. People who lost less than 5% of their weight had the same benefit in terms of reduction of heart attacks and strokes and death, the same benefit as people who lost a lot of weight. So I think we have pretty good evidence now, both from the animal studies, people with type 2 diabetes, and people living with obesity, that is more to the benefits of GLP-1 than simply blood sugar control or weight loss.
Right. And so there's also an anti-inflammatory role for GLP-1, and that likely maybe contributes to this too. And I was wondering if you could tell or talk about a little bit about how we think or know so far how GLP-1 influences anti-inflammation. It seems like there's sort of a direct action in the gut, but also a systemic one.
Yeah, so again, I'll break it down into the, three buckets. So there are some GLP-1 receptors on some of our immune cells in the gut, as you pointed out. These are T cells. And when we have inflammation in the gut that surrounds those T cells, GLP-1 is very useful in suppressing inflammation. In fact, I think that's a major role of why we have GLP-1 in the gut. It's because the gut is often susceptible to inflammation, and GLP-1 is anti-inflammatory there. But we also have the indirect benefits of weight loss. It's very clear if you lose weight, and in fact, if you have better blood sugar control, that also reduces inflammation in our bodies. And then it really is interesting that there are GLP-1 receptors in our brain that can send a signal to other parts of our body to reduce inflammation. So I think there are multiple different ways that GLP-1 can reduce inflammation. And there's many kinds of inflammation, right? So there are dozens of different kinds of inflammation in our body. And I think the way that GLP-1 is going to reduce inflammation will depend in part upon where is the inflammation and what kind of inflammation is going on.
Right. And so I guess just conceptually, it's a bit odd because I know, looking at just in the intestine, it seemed like GLP-1 can be released from cells in the gut when there are stresses like toxins and like bacterial pathogenic elements, like LPS. How is that connected with what we know of GLP-1 in terms of being this sort of powerful treatment for type 2 diabetes and obesity? How are those sorts of responses kind of conceptually linked to you?
Yeah, so I don't think they're very easily conceptually linked, but let me just try and give you an example of the relative importance. So if I eat a meal, my GLP-1 levels go up 2 to 3-fold. So food stimulates GLP-1 secretion. If I have a really bad gut infection, my GLP-1 levels go up tenfold. And I think that tells us that, these toxins or bacterial products or metabolites are really powerful stimulators of GLP-1 secretion because, as you point out, the GLP-1 system responds to infection and then helps to take care of infection. And I think, people often ask me, why do we have GLP-1? And as we already mentioned, I don't think it's to help us control blood sugar or to control body weight. There are many more important things that do that. But I do think it's very well situated to help us control gut inflammation. And remember, over time, today we're living with the challenge of obesity and an epidemic, and we're struggling as a society. But if we go back 100 or 200 years ago or 500 years ago, and we said, what's the great threat to human health? It was dysentery and cholera and Shigella and these terrible bacterial infections that threaten people's lives. And so you needed to have a powerful system to take care of these infections and reduce inflammation. And I think that's why we have GLP-1 in our system.
Yeah. So, it's fascinating that they've worked out to be this potent drug now, and they have all these other interesting things that they're up to. So I guess my question, in terms of, I've kind of touched on a little bit of the sort of the breadth of work that's going on now on GLP-1 drugs. They've worked for type 2 diabetes. They're effective for obesity. There's trials for looking at preventing kidney failure and protecting the liver and protecting from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. I know you've recently published data on Alzheimer's. And what area are you sort of most optimistic about in terms of the next sort of potential, avenue of treatment with these drugs?
Yeah, so I'm not an optimistic person. I'm a very reserved, guarded, careful person, and I love to be surprised with positive results. But I'll turn the question around. I'll say, what area am I most excited about? And I think
Mhm.
the neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, these are very common. We don't have great, effective, safe treatments for these conditions. It really cries out for new approaches to help people delay the progression of their disease. And there's some very promising data now. There have been 4 human trials in people with Parkinson's disease treated with these medicines. And there's a whole bunch of indirect evidence suggesting that maybe there'll be some benefit in people with Alzheimer's. So there are phase 3 trials now, the final stages of testing before approval in both people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And to me, that would be just fantastic if we could have a small benefit that's meaningful in these patient populations, because we really, as a community, we really haven't done well in helping people with these terrible, challenging disorders.
And do you think that the sort of avenue of how these drugs are potentially helpful in this case is the anti-inflammatory effects, or are there
Yeah, so
additional?
we will never be able to perfectly explain if they work, how they work. So there's definitely a reduction in inflammation. They improve the health of the cells in our brain. They improve the way that the cells can communicate with each other. They improve the power structure of the mitochondria in our brain. So there's probably 4 or 5 different benefits of these medicines. And it'll be very difficult to tease out if the medicines work. It'll be difficult to say, well, it's 60% this and 30% this and 10% this. Well, what a great challenge to be able to have if they work. That'll be really exciting.
Yeah. So, in terms of, in addition to the sort of different treatments conditions that GLP-1 can be used against, the people are also looking at different improving the formulation. So there's, dual therapies, uh, 3-component therapies now, and they're in oral therapies that are they're trying to reduce the use of injections. In terms of, optimizing the drugs that we take as products, how do you see that as sort of moving the needle on the benefits of GLP-1 drugs? And, you mentioned before when, the first versions of this drug, people got really sick. There was a lot of side effects. How much as we sort of try to optimize, we will be bumping up against that problem again.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to use my number 3 for all the waves of innovation we're going to see. So we're going to see new molecules, and they're going to be things that are added on to GLP-1 to make GLP-1 more effective, to maybe make it preferential for treating liver disease or for heart disease or for kidney disease or maybe greater weight loss, maybe even fewer side effects, as you mentioned. And then we have the ways that we deliver these medicines. We have oral tablets coming that will be much easier and cheaper to make, and that will be really important since we have a sort of a supply chain crisis right now with these medicines. And then we have medicines that will probably be once a month or maybe once every 3 months or so. So that will be more convenient for people. And then, further down the road, there are people trying to use gene therapy or gene editing or cell-based therapy that might even eliminate the need for these injections. So we're going to see a tremendous amount of innovation in this space and really updates every 3 to 6 months for the next 5 to 10 years. It's a pretty cool time in terms of the industry really trying to improve what we have today.
Yeah. And do you think that we know enough about making these? So I think the one of the triple acting method or drugs that are working on GLP-1, another hormone called GIP, or I don't know if you have the
Yeah,
name
that's fine. Yeah.
GIP, and then glucagon itself. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Yeah.
of
So I'll
Trudy.
rephrase your question, which is Do we know these new medicines are going to be safe? Okay. And,
Yeah.
and I always say we have 20 years of GLP-1 in the clinic because remember April 28th, 2005, it's, coming up on 20 years for the first GLP-1 medicine. But every time we have a new medicine, we're starting all over. So we
Mhm.
cannot take for granted that the same safety database that we are pretty comfortable with for the existing GLP-1 medicines, we can't automatically apply that safety database to the new medicines, particularly when they're adding glucagon or adding GIP or adding amylin or all sorts of new entities. So we have to start again and say, let's look at the safety, let's look at the risk benefit ratio, let's make sure there are no populations that haven't been studied carefully, and that's our responsibility. We just can never rest in terms of looking at the safety of new medicines.
Right. And do you expect that, is there any sort of data to direct your thinking in terms of, in these, combinations of drugs, would they be better targeted for, say, if there's a neuroprotective effect or if there's a liver protective, for protecting the liver or something, the organ
Yeah.
specific benefits?
So it's a little early because the first combination medicine that was approved is tirzepatide, marketed
Mhm.
as Mounjaro or Zepbound, and that's been around for a few years, and it is more effective for glucose control and body weight. But in terms of these other conditions, right now I think the best bet is that medicines that have glucagon in them, so glucagon plus GLP-1, they're pretty special for treating liver disease because glucagon acts directly on the liver. So I'm looking to those medicines to really be elevated to a special place for the treatment of people with metabolic liver disease. And we've started to get some very impressive clinical trial data with those medicines, and we're going to get more. So that's, I think, the clearest sub-indication where there might be a benefit. But right now, it's still early days for these other medicines.
And so, moving forward in terms of the drugs we have now, one thing that people are always thinking about is once, you see benefits, whether it's, weight loss or control of type 2 diabetes, how do you get off of them? And so, I know it's a little early to think about that for other benefits of potential treatments for GLP-1 drugs, but, in terms of, what we're using them for now, do you see a sort of a weaning off? I know you were talking about sort of gene therapies in the future that might be more sort of permanent solutions. But what are your thoughts on terms of, we've seen in the past with GLP-1 drugs that people eventually do stop taking them. And then, how do you see things working out like that for semaglutide
Yeah,
and
so we have to go back and say, why are we taking these medicines? So
Mhm.
if the answer is, I wanted to lose 25 pounds to get healthier, then there's probably no harm in seeing if you can gradually reduce the dose of the medicine and come off, and I'll address what happens in a minute. On the other hand, if you're saying, you know what, I had a heart attack or a stroke, and I'm trying to reduce the development of having another one, or I'm trying to prevent the development of kidney failure because I have type 2 diabetes, then there's really no evidence that stopping the medicines is going to maintain the protection you will receive when you take the medicines. So what happens when you stop for weight loss, for example? That's a common question. So the early data with semaglutide said, you know what, about 75% of people gain at least 75% of the weight back. So that was disappointing. But we had a trial reported last year with tirzepatide, and these people got tirzepatide for 36 weeks, and then half of them stopped the medicine entirely, and half continued. And it was actually amazing to me. So people who had no tirzepatide for a year, 46% of them kept at least 10% of their weight off, and 25% of them kept at least 15% of their weight off. And that was amazing to me. And what that really means is the dogma that says, oh, everybody gains back all the weight or gains back even more weight, that's not correct. I think we're going to start seeing that some people are susceptible to weight regain. Some people can actually do pretty well and adapt their lifestyle and food intake and activity patterns and maintain a lot of the weight. And so that to me, a challenge is how to identify these people in advance. How can I tell someone at the start and say, I'm pretty sure you're going to have to take these medicines for an indefinite period of time to maintain the benefits. Or another conversation might be, I know from biomarkers or genetic testing that you might only need to take the medicines for 6 months or 9 months, and then you can have a drug holiday for the next couple of years. So this is the evolution of precision medicine, and we're not there yet, but I think there's hints that we'll be able to get there if we really study populations and look at responders and non-responders.
Yeah, and that seems like it would be pretty important if you're looking at sort of gene therapies to sort of address GLP-1.
Yeah, and if you're a pharmaceutical company, maybe you don't want to stop the medicines. Maybe that's not a message you're anxious to convey. But if you're a cautious practitioner, 100% we'd love to know how to most, target these medicines to the people who need them.
Um, so I wanted to ask just one more question, and then we have a bunch of questions from the audience. Just, to follow up, I asked you what you were most optimistic about in terms of, next round of treatment options for GLP-1 drugs. And so I'll change that to, what is your most exciting question that you want to see answered for GLP-1 drugs in terms of anything about, the unknowns about how these drugs work or what they can do? What are you most exciting about knowing in your lifetime about these drugs?
So I think that the actions of GLP-1 in the brain are, as we discussed briefly, really fascinating. And I don't think we know enough about them. And, I have been told by colleagues that they have seen families with inactivating mutations in the GLP-1 receptor. And so what did those families present with? And it's seizure disorders, epilepsy. And so that just tells me, and we have some animal data that suggests GLP-1 is important for controlling seizure activity, but that just reminds me how much we don't know about what GLP-1 is doing in the brain and different parts of the brain and what its potential might be in various neurological disorders. We haven't talked today about addiction and cocaine use and alcohol use and smoking and other neuropsychiatric issues. And I think there's tremendous potential for learning much more about what GLP-1 does in the normal brain and then in people who are challenged with neurological disorders.
Great. Yeah, there's so many things, but yes, disordered use, or sorry, dependency use disorders, definitely another topic we didn't get to talk about. But while time is running low, let me switch over to the questions from the audience. So we have one from the Iron Herder on YouTube. The GLP-1 application that I find most intriguing is its positive use to solve problems with parenteral feeding. Is this pursued? Is this being pursued?
So that might be related to GLP-2.
Okay.
So we identified what GLP-2 does. It's the sister peptide to GLP-1. It's in the same gene. It's just a little bit, downstream in location. And GLP-2 helps your gut absorb nutrients. And there are some people who've had a sufficient surgical resection of their gut to the point where they can't absorb food, they can't absorb the fluids they drink, and they're dependent on intravenous feeding to stay alive. And it's a really challenging existence. Next week, everybody, or in a couple of weeks, everyone's going to get in a car or a plane and go visit their family for Thanksgiving. But if you need to be hooked up to intravenous feeding every night to stay alive, you can't, bring all the technology and the equipment and the bags of fluid with you. So the quality of life is not great. And people treated with GLP-2 can start eating again and absorb more of their food and nutrients. And about 20-25% of them completely become free of the need to receive intravenous nutrition every night. And this is marketed as a drug called teduglutide or Gattex. And so GLP-1 has a little bit of effects like that, but it's really GLP-2 that has those powerful actions.
Great. And we have one from Steen Larson. I would like to hear about GLP-1 drugs as adjuvants for type 1 diabetes treatment.
Yeah, so would I. So, there were trials. We did have some trials with liraglutide in people with type 1 diabetes, and they did work a little bit. but not enough to have Novo Nordisk move forward filing for regulatory approval. But there are multiple reasons why this still might be a really important area to pursue. So we've talked about the reduction of kidney disease, the reduction of heart attacks, reduction of strokes. These are all complications that people with type 1 diabetes need to avoid as well. And we should really study whether or not GLP-1 might work to reduce heart disease and kidney disease in people with type 1 diabetes. It's really critically important that we do that. And then there's some really intriguing early reports that say if we give GLP-1 early, right at the time when we diagnose type 1 diabetes, might it be possible to keep the few remaining insulin producing cells in our pancreas alive and healthy for longer periods of time? And there's some very early data that suggest maybe that's possible. So I think these are both really important areas for future study in type 1 diabetes.
Really good. And we have another one from Nick Bodmer. Are people on GLP-1 drugs for weight loss expected to stop once they hit the target weight? They seem to be advantages to staying on it for a longer term. I think we talked about this a little
Yeah, we
bit, but
talked a little bit. So I think the answer will be that some people might be able to reduce the dose and some people might be able to stop. And as long as they maintain their new adapted healthy lifestyle, they might be able to keep a lot of the weight off. Whereas other people, unfortunately, will gain back most of the weight. And it's very difficult right now to predict who's going to be in which group.
yeah. I think we had another kind of question about that from Billy Kay. He said, I hear a lot of negativity and tales of backsliding once they wrap up taking GLP-1. Are there success stories? So it sounds like a success stories of weaning off of them. So it sounds like there are for some, and it's just a matter
There
of.
are for some, particularly with the newer tirzepatide data, but let's just remind ourselves of one fact. If you go to the doctor and you're not feeling well and you go to the physician and they say, oh, you know what, you have rheumatoid arthritis, you have high cholesterol, you have multiple sclerosis, you have Crohn's disease, you have ulcerative colitis. I could give you a list of 100 chronic conditions. You would never expect to take medicines for 6 or 12 months and then to stop the medicines. You would expect to say, I have a serious disease that is going to require lifelong therapy. Yet for some reason, the conversation around obesity, which is associated with more cancer, more heart attacks, more strokes, more kidney diseases, 11 different serious conditions that are increased in people with obesity. For some reason, we like to talk about, well, you won't take this for very long, right? You'll just take it for 6 or 12 months and then you'll be able to fix the problem yourself. But we never ask someone with these other serious chronic illnesses to fix the problems themselves without ongoing medicine. So it's a little bit unusual in terms of how we approach the treatment of obesity, a very serious chronic illness, versus 100 other serious chronic illnesses.
Right. So Lena wants to ask, I'd like to hear about GLP-1 being used as a mast cell stabilizers. And I don't know a lot about this question.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot of information. She probably knows more about this than I do. So sorry. I mean, there may be some data in terms of allergic reactions and conditions where this is being explored on an occasional basis, but I don't think there's a lot of literature on this.
Okay. And then Marcus wants to know, when do we expect to see tablet forms of these drugs for weight loss to be on the market? So this is the oral drugs that are being worked on.
So there is one, yeah, so there is one tablet now that semaglutide is available in a tablet form. It's marketed as Rybelsus, either 3, 7, 14 milligrams once a day for type 2 diabetes. But the small molecule drugs that are not the proteins, but they're small chemicals, those may be available, if we're optimistic, in about 2 years or so. And the drug furthest along that's in phase 3 is orforglipron by Eli Lilly, and then there's half a dozen of them in phase 2. So maybe 2 to 3 years, if we're fortunate, we'll see the new small molecules, and hopefully they'll be easier to make, more widely available, and from my lips to Indianapolis's ears, maybe less expensive.
Yeah, so I guess one question I have to follow up on that, just so we have a few more minutes. In terms of like availability of this drug, in we've talked about sort of the effects in the brain. How easily does this cross the blood-brain barrier? Is that because I know in in your animal studies, you used like direct injections into the brain to look at that.
Yeah.
Is there, yeah,
So these drugs don't get into the brain very well at all.
okay.
That might be a good thing if we want to avoid more nausea and vomiting and aversive reactions that are mediated by centers in the brain. But they're very effective in communicating to the brain. So they can tell our brain centers that we're not hungry. They can tell our brain centers to slow down our gut motility. They do reduce inflammation in many parts of the brain. So they have very effective ways of communicating to even regions deep beyond the blood-brain barrier without the medicines actually getting to many different regions of the brain.
Okay. So there was one other component of Marcus's question about if we have an oral formulation, would you expect that to be sort of more or less effective, and be the sort of side effects be any different in terms of like more or less severe if they were taken directly?
I think the side effects are going to be pretty similar. The small molecules that are being tested now are not designed to get into the brain. It may
Mhm.
be in the future that if we see some success in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, that some companies will test the possibility that getting these medicines deeper into the brain in the regions that are affecting Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease people, maybe we'll see brain penetrant drugs, and we'll have to ask, is that a good thing, or is that come with a new set of side effects? But right now, most of the medicines don't get into the brain, and even the new tablets really don't penetrate the brain very effectively.
Well, I think that was the questions that I saw. And so this has been a fantastic conversation. There was so much to talk about, and we could certainly spend a lot more time talking, but I know you probably have many important research things to do.
No,
So,
I just have to go babysit one of the grandsons. So
oh,
the
okay.
next important thing to do.
Also a very important answer.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely. And thank you to everyone who tuned in, and we'll have a write-up shortly. And thank you again. And we'll hopefully be able to talk to you again soon sometime about
Thanks
the
very much.
next development.
Thank you.
Take care.